Oh, hi, babe. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Oh, good.
It's
Oh,
beautiful day.
wonderful. It is a beautiful day. And is that Yuri? Hey, guess what room Yuri's in? He's in the twin room. He's in the twin room in that room right over there. Hi, Yuri. How you doing?
What's up? I'm good.
Oh, good.
Excited.
Oh, it's so beautiful. So Yuri's in our house, and it just gives us such hopes and dreams. And then
It's
the beauty,
amazing.
yeah, it actually is amazing. Oh, we're doing like the Brady Bunch thing where they have four faces in a little square. Oh, wait, that's how I have the view. You don't necessarily see it that way. Hello, Mr. Thomas Jockin. Yuri's in our house. Yuri's great. He's actually, I think, in the room you slept in. Yeah, I know, the key room. You
Michelle,
see,
what were
he's
you
right
thinking about
there.
with responsive responsibility? Also,
Yuri, we talked about the introduction problem a lot last night, so we'll probably get into
Mhm.
that again. And also how introduction allows the possibility of everyone being brought to the place for the network effect, as we've talked about kind of sociologically and different things. So that was fun. But Michelle, what was that you were talking about with response and responsibility?
Oh, yeah. Well, great to see you all. So happy to have you here, Yuri. And I think that I was, yeah, just thinking about the wordplay. I always tend to do that for some reason, but um, I was thinking about how today we have like a very responsive age. Like you can respond to messaging. That's like Paul Virilio talks about how one of our main technological advancements has just been speed and communication, which is great. It's like a lot of benefits to that. But hey, Luber, but I was thinking about, I wonder if this on a psychological level is like makes us have a different relationship to responsibility. So yeah, I was thinking about how yeah, it's almost as if we a new ethic develops because of medium technologies where you feel like more responsible, you feel responsible for more than you used to have to be responsible for because you're aware of more and you can respond instantaneously. But like should you always feel that responsibility, and does it cultivate the same responsibility as, you know, I don't know, just having to do stuff that is a little more face to face or a little more like tactile or like hands on. Because like the effort to respond is not very much, but psychologically it can be, existentially it can be, because you're like, oh my gosh, I've got like 7 different messaging streams that come in and I want to make sure I'm getting back to people. Um, so I don't know, it because there is this responsibility, and it makes me think then about how one of the things that is much more regular is like responding and response in general, and are you responding to what's happening halfway across the world? And I'm not saying it's bad to do those things, I'm just saying I'm wondering how that influences our understanding of like responsibility at large. And Luber, I'm so sorry, we'll get back to you. I'm so sorry. I loved your message and I love that idea, so I'm really sorry, do apologize.
That's actually
I
perfect
didn't say
because you didn't
respond. Now
respond, so you're not a
violate the
responsible
ethic.
person, right?
I'm
So
not
that's a
responsible.
no,
I
it's a
didn't
terrible
respond. I'm
thing.
not.
No, it's a terrible thing. I really
Literally
like
no worries.
no,
Like
that's what
I
Okay.
that's just
know
what
where
they
you
say,
guys' your
Michelle.
minds are
No,
at.
no, no worries.
You
It's
don't
just
got
what
to
you're
think
supposed
about
to
it with me.
say. No, on different things. No, he's so sweet. No, it
Thanks,
is very
Luber.
interesting.
Yeah.
And Luber, it's
Yeah.
good to
So those
see
are my
you.
thoughts.
And
I'm gonna mute
everyone should
myself.
see Luber. I think Yuri is in the room you slept in the twin room. Yuri is in the room next door. So he's came. Isn't that like so? Oh my
Super cool.
goodness. So it's super
Super
cool.
cool.
Yuri came all the way to Virginia, so we've been having a lot of fun. And Reed has been climbing on his back, just like he was
Yeah.
on Michelle's back.
Like you write
So
it
that was a
down.
lot of fun. We enjoyed that very much. But no, I definitely think there's some kind of like responsibility is the ability to keep up with responses, to respond to things. Like one's ability to be a responsible person is tied to that. That's very interesting. And how then response in that way is not necessarily keeping up with like things or making sure the water is fixed or the pipes is fixed, but actually responding to things. And it's an interesting kind of responsibility that has emerged, which I find very interesting. And Javier Rivera, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well. And salute you for taking on fiction, because that's a fun world to be going into deeper and deeper and different things. But that world of like responsibility and how that is now like, do you have the ability to respond? And if you don't, is there some sort of issue there? Is very interesting. And maybe actually This ties into the introduction problem because there's a notion of, well, if you're not responding, then we can't take care of the introduction problem to move into network effects. And so there's kind of an idea that we want to move into those connections to have possibility occur. And if you're not doing, there are problems. And Mr. Winnie, it's good to see you. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Jockin. Mr. Luber.
What's up? What's up? I watched your video with Bard, and that was really good. You asked this question. I made a comment because the question, like, to me, it's like once you ask that question, the real problem emerges, which is I'm like paraphrasing the question you asked, so forgive me. But basically, it was like you're talking about. Basically what you're getting at is like, okay, Hegel is really thinking about thinking, and how does that have to do with the pre-rational? How does that have to do with like when you before the split occurs? It was like at an hour and 24. I'm like spacing on the exact question, but basically, it brought up the whole notion of like storytelling. It brought like on Bard's end, which got me all like giddy when he like brought up like how important narration is, or storytelling, same difference to me, in this context. But basically, in terms of like the introduction problem, how do you go about making a decision? Because at the end of the day, like when you go through the dialectical process and you realize that you have to address this pre-rational element here, and how you address it is always based off of a decision. So the question is, how do you make a decision in regards to this pre-rational dimension, or this non-rational, sorry, non-rational. I don't mean to say pre. So I think it's something that needs to be taught. And it's tricky because you can't really have necessarily a formal structure of this non-rational dimension, because it's like what you guys talk about in this video. It's like addressing this no thingness, not saying that there's nothing, Jockin, but that there's this pure experience where you gave this example about, you in the art gallery and you're looking at your hand, and it's thought always comes after the experience. So when you become aware of these dynamics, how do you make a decision with this non-rational dimension? For me, this is why I think theme is very important. This is just like, at least it's helping me structure where theme comes into place, because I've been struggling. Where does it come into place? Does it even deserve to come into place at all? And I think it's in question. So theme is basically making a decision about how you see the non-rational dimension, because I think it's a choice on how you understand the non-rational dimension, because there is no pure understanding of it. There is no one this is how you understand the non-rational dimension. It's always a choice of how you understand that non-rational dimension, and then out of that choice, the dialectical movement of thought emerges. And then at that point, it's how does this dialectical movement, how is it faithful to the choice that I made about the non-rational dimension? And I think that's like a very good starting point on this like science of beauty, so to speak, because I think the science of beauty is, at first, this beatific vision has to do with recognizing, truly seeing the non-rational dimension, because I would say that beatific vision is synonymous with literally understanding the non-rational dimension. This is pragmatics at its purest. Yes, I'm trying. I think I'm trying to reduce this complexity for myself. I'm not saying it's like justifiable, but like I'm just trying to have some kind of landscape for me personally to play with. Is it applicable, or is it true? I don't applicable to others, or is it actually true to some extent? Am I cutting off maybe key components to this? Perhaps, but for the sake of right now, in this discussion, I'm trying to basically there's like three phases. There's the phase of realizing the non-rational dimension, which is akin to the beatific strike, and then realizing the dialectical movement of thinking, of how thought thinks once you have that, once you make that decision, once you see that beatific vision. And then the third step is realizing both and then making sure they're faithful to each other. And theme to me really makes sense on how it's faithful to each other. Like, how can the dialectical movement be faithful to the initial realization of the non-rational, which is always the consequence of the realization, is always a decision on how you see it. So I just wanted to say that that's what I've been thinking about lately, and I think that has to do with the introduction, because a true introduction begins at when you realize how there needs to be a faithfulness between the dialectical movement and the beatific vision. That's when introduction starts. And maybe it doesn't push back, but I'm just, thinking out loud. So
No, magnificent. Well, there's a few things, to your work, Bard and Process and Event will talk about metaphysics as narratology, right? That it's really in the business of certain narratives. And also by emphasizing narrative, where philosophy and storytelling go together, as you've obviously talked about before, there's really an idea that you're moving beyond, say, transcendental grounding, looking for more sort of narratives. Now, another key component in his thinking that I think brings us to encounterology, encounters of limits, et cetera, so forth, I believe, is membranics. And really the idea is that the membranic, when two membranes encounter one another, so there's a lot of emphasis on the Silk Road, there's a lot of emphasis on these kind of, people coming into encounter with one another, that becomes kind of the basis for the ethics of interrelationality, is a term, I believe, from Process and Event, but it's in the encounter. What's very interesting is the suggestion there, we've talked about encounterology, surprise, and all of those things, that the question is what is the causer? When does the theme appear, right? The argument is, if I were to, I believe Bard would suggest that it is when membranes encounter, when membranes hit, when there is an encounter, the causer is in fact in that encounter that then can arise to the theme. But here's why the introduction problem is actually a big deal. I don't know if membranes do that if you're actually just encountering to get the introductory logic. You know how last time we were saying that basically colleges are a bunch of years of just introductory and then you get to the PH discussion? There's something to be said where the causer does not arise until after the introductory problem is dealt with, right? So then what ends up happening is actually this membranic effect, encounterology, hitting limits, and this may also apply. Mr. Ebert had a wonderful talk on the Overton window at Voicecraft and different things. And I also wonder if encounters are also part of thinking political strategy and the movement of political discourse. Things would have to be expanded on that. I'll pass it to Jockin and Mr. Wynn. But what Mr. Bard, when he talks about limit, like, Mr. Ebert will talk about internal, external limits. You have a saturation. There's something about a membrane, like you think a cell, which is kind of marking a barrier between the internal and the external, but a membrane is distinct from a wall because a membrane, is there a little hat around that dog? Because it's friggin' adorable. I think I saw it. He ran off. He took it. Dang it. There it is. There it is. It's a trumpet dog. It's a trumpet dog. And so, the membrane has to be porous though, because a good membrane will let nutrients in and it will let excrement out, not reverse it, or it will die like in a cell, right? So a membrane defines a distinction between, an external and internal, and you can have membranes nested in other membranes and all of these different things, right? So there's a sense where, and people can mean different things by different languages. Like when two people encounter, there's a way in which there are different membranes that are encountering. Like you don't enter into my internal organs or my brain, and then there are different complexities and blah, blah, blah. People will make distinctions between cities and cells and into like internested membranes and so on, right? But basically in the encounter, that's when you have membranes hit. And that seems to be where the potential of the causer is. But the argument, based on your work, Mr. Luber, but what seems to be the case is I'm of the opinion is that actually you have to overcome the introduction problem to get the membranes to arise to the theme, because here's the issue. In the encounter, if it is surprising, by definition, unveils the non-rational space. That in that talk at Parallax, I was also talking about pre-rational based on like Peirce and all these with abduction and different things, right? Because then it's like, oh, wow, if I just operate rationally, then I have to totalize over this other membrane. So there's a space that opens up that unveils the different basis of rationalities. And then that question comes into the foreground that then has to be thought. So I would say, based on what you're saying, the narratology for Bard leads to membranic thinking with an emphasis on encounter that I do think we can associate with encountering limits and different. I think there's space in that conversation, certainly for Mr. Ebert's work on freak theory, that then arises to questions of ethics of interrelationality, which then if we think of metaphysics as narratology, I think it brings into line some of the work that you're doing. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Mr. Wynn. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you on this fine day. I hope you're doing well.
You know, something I was talking to one of my pupil in my Halcyon course this afternoon, and we were talking about the nature of love and hate. And actually, and I'm reminded of something very interesting about that. It's a general. And it also came up a lot the question of violence too in my pro seminar group, is the nature of our understanding of contraries and the versus privations, those differences. And in particular, I think the area here in question here is what Michelle is bringing up with responsiveness and speed and time, is the idea that somehow like there's almost an unaware ignorance that we become aware of. And as a result, we become more responsible as a result of that. Because I thought of a note, I was reading Philippus recently and was talking about a kind of unaware ignorance that's acting on the soul versus the using of thought to recollect, to realize what we're lacking. And the pain and a note and statement that only a very few get to recognize that. Basically, this state of forgetting what we are, forgetting of knowledge, as an example. It's a very rare quality, requirement of reflection to do that. So just to meditate on what Luber's pointing out here on this kind of operation of dialectics with the beatific vision, just kind of playing on that point. But I think this idea of permeable membranes, right? The part of it's interesting because generally, like if you look at active inference, the idea is that, you know, objects are not really interacting directly with each other. We're using models, right? Basically models interact with each other. So it's almost like the coupling property is explained for radical otherness, that obviously you're not me and I am not you. We have to synchronize over a model of some kind of abstraction is required to synchronize around. And by the similarity of that abstraction, that model, we actually we synchronize together. I think that's an interesting point, because part of the introduction problem is that idea that you have to get access to these models in the first place to even be affected by them. Like you have to understand the terms and the notions and the relationships of them to generate that. And part of that is actually through understanding of contraries. So when a term is being used, we have to know what we mean by that. And usually, and Aristotle talks about this in Topics. I reread that this morning just to remind myself of it. Is by the operation of the contraries, we know what we mean by terms. So, for example, actually on this issue of love and hate, there's a very big difference between talking about if you say love is the desire for possession versus the wish of the good of the other. Those definitional differences and their inverses showing their contraries actually point at a very different responses of understanding. So I'm kind of chewing on that at the moment. I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's wonderful, and I hope the class is going well, Mr. Jockin. Dimitri, it is good to see you, sir, and I'll give it to Mr. Wynn and Luber. Dimitri recently had a new Substack, and that's always an event. They're very well written, so good to see you, sir. And no, I definitely think, like, for example, like love as possession or love as the well-being of the other, that's an example where, based on your definitions, that then determines what is rational, right? So what do you decide? Like the basis of what you accept then determine how you should practice from it, right? So if you base if you really want to locate the questions that you're going to be unfolding metaphysically in the encounterology, in the encounter of the other, and that being the precise location in the surprise by which you are going to think things like love or ethics or good or beauty, that's going to be very different than if you're just going to think it from an abstract basis or some sort of more stable state. So I think that's really important on where do you locate it at. And then if there is something where models are necessary for lining up, then there's also what we see in the encounter of membranes or in limits encountering one or another, an unveiling that models are being used necessary to line up, and yet there's a kind of abyssal basis to it. And how do you think in that moment? Like, it's kind of sense to, based on Luber and Alex's work, like that is the causer where you're forced to see that. And what then is the command, the thing that arises by which how you should respond to knowing that? Should it be having more encounters? Should it be avoiding encounters? Should it be you must get better at encounters? You must figure out to do it in a manner that causes beauty. There's a certain command that arises. It's like once you see the sailor, you can't unsee the sailor, based on the Nabokov example. When you see something, you can't unsee it, which is a certain loss of freedom, but in that, that's also a gaining of a direction based on the theme, as a good story would require. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn Luber and then Mr. Rivera. Mr. Wynn, it is good to see you, sir.
Good to see everybody tonight. I just wanted to, because basically I caught Luber, I think halfway through talking. Same as last week's The Net, I'm still reading this book called Broken Hegemonies by a guy called Rainer Schurman. And I think for me, this is like the definition of, how is the mic, by the way? How's the audio? It's fine, yeah, cool. It's basically the definition of, I think, of the end point of a lot of our philosophies today, because broken hegemonies means basically what Luber said. Like, we have these kind of like this absolute choice in the space of the non-rational to make a choice concerning kind of how we deal with that tragic situation in some sense. So broken hegemonies talks about the tragic, and the way that Rainer Schurman sees being is kind of like the groundlessness of Heidegger, where we enter this kind of tragic destitution of form, basically. So the way that we relate to each other, if we think that the way we relate to each other is grounded upon some kind of absolute hegemonic principle, if we don't see how that principle is subject to history, subject to change, subject to the undoing of narratives in some sense, we then can't have a narrative which makes the world livable. So it's a very kind of Nietzschean perspective, which looks at Heidegger's middle period. Even if Schurman actually does a lot of literature on the letting be and releasement of Heidegger, but Schurman himself sticks to that kind of philosophy where we encounter limits and we can kind of hang out in that space of recognizing the limits of our narratives. And we can sit there and know this, you know? And I think that's the end point of philosophy for him, is to kind of remain within that kind of indeterminate space with indeterminacy. And because things happen there, like we can have a knowledge of the changing and the shifting and everything. And there is a quotation I thought I might read. So when basically he talks about how within thinking, this master stroke happens. Like there's a stroke of luck. Maybe this goes back to what we said last week about surprise. Like something happens with a stroke. I think he takes the word from Nietzsche. He says basically Schurman puts it in clear terms and also connects it to the relationship between universality and singularity that arises in each sustained phantasmic world. So basically the horizons are phantasmic. That's how he sees them, like narratives in that precise sense, actually. He says, it is also the masterstroke of the one who recognizes that whatever pretends to be unconditioned, or that what a certain epoch-making decree wishes unconditionally, has a phantasmatic status. And one ends up a winner with all of these strokes which destroy things. And he says, winning what? And for him, it's the real, if one believes Nietzsche, a world that holds together, in any case, a livable world. A phantasm is hegemonic when an entire culture relies on it as if it provided that in the name of which one speaks and acts. Such a chief represented is at work upon the unspeakable singular when it calls it a part of the whole. Hegemonies transform the singular into a particular. They serve to say what is, to classify and inscribe, to distribute proper and common nouns, since Plato, making such discriminations, has amounted to obliterating the singular for the sake of the common, and to live outside this common that obliterates. So basically he's saying, like, we kind of like this kind of Nietzschean interpretation of Nietzsche, where we have to deal with life, but when we recognize that everything's really contingent, relative, and underneath all of these hegemonic structures, there are singular beings. When we recognize this, then we have the space for the absolute choice. But and I think this is kind of like a definition of how I see a lot of postmodern philosophy, actually. And like good postmodern philosophy is it kind of hangs out in this space of indeterminability, says there's a limit, and says, okay, but this is only at this point, we just have to kind of deal with what remains in some sense. Like The Remains of Being is a book that's quite good in this world. But I think this is my question for myself, and this is always repeats itself on the net. is there a way to know with a different quality of knowledge, perhaps more phenomenology than ontology in some sense? Is there a way in the experience of the shifting and the changing and the strokes and the dismantling and the destruction? Is there a way to talk about being? Because I really think with Heidegger that that's what everything comes down to. How do you experience being? What is being's truth for you? Can we know being's truth outside of just my particular interpretation? Can we know this together? I think there is a way to know something which is beyond the simple gesture of narrative. I think there is a knowledge. And I think it's to know that being is that which gives each narrative its hegemonic position. And that will always change. That will always shift. But being is the graceful gifting of each specific horizon, of each specific narrative that we use to make sense of the world in some sense. And I think when you recognize this, you can talk about indeterminacy through determinacy. You can talk about its quality, its character. Like this came up last week, the grace of the surprise, which breaches through each narrative. And I think when we get with this, we understand that being is very graceful and very promising, very virtuous. And there's always something which is kind of beautiful through each narrative. And I think this is what then connects to nihilism. Like nihilism is overcome when you recognize that you don't need to accurately say what being is in its unconditional truth. But when you let that be, when you let objectivity be and say, okay, fine, that's a narrative, you experience the gifting and the grace of life. And I think that's what being is. And I think this is where like philosophy, I think, will start to move to. I think that's my gesture, like about like, how do we go postmodern? I think you don't go post it. You just talk about how the narratives that we do make sense of life are given gracefully, generally. And then we can actually then be pragmatic. Luba, when I said Luba, pure Luba, like, is to affirm the narratives and know that they can be given over gracefully. And then we can choose, make absolute choices for like opened narrative, released narratives, you know? And this then goes to what Jockin was talking about with the beautiful, like, and this again, empiricism, we can be like, not empiricism, like efficiency. We can be efficient for the surprise. We can choose those narratives which are more likely to prepare us for the surprise. And of course, those narratives are still historically given, but we can kind of point our way towards the clearing or the indeterminacy, you know, within the narrative. And I think this is just a way to like try and get through what Sherman's saying. Because I'm kind of surprised that Sherman is kind of stuck in this middle period of Heidegger, because he wrote a nice article on Meister Eckhart and Heidegger on releasement. And that was the first text I read when I went, oh, wow, like that's being's way. It's not just a way to exist, it's being's way, maybe. Anyway, thank you.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Luba, Javier, and then Mr. Ebert. I think, like, if you take seriously the notion of it is the encounter, it is the surprise, it is the limit, then the point of narratives, or like as Bard is saying, metaphysics is narratology, the point of structures of thought is not precisely to find the cause or a theme, just to allude to Luba's work, in your narrative, but to have a narrative to bring into a counter so that a surprise is possible. That's the weird thing. And, you know, Jurij is asking, like, on postmodern and the absolute choice, like, if you actually encounter otherness and you're open for otherness and thus unveil the groundlessness of your ground that you require to even move into a place where you can have groundlessness unveiled to you. That's the weird thing. You need ground in order to move to the place where you can have an encounter that opens up groundlessness as a clearing. Thus, an absolute choice is possible. This then means you locate your ethics and your thinking in that encounter. But then, of course, not all, this is where it gets tricky. It would seem as all surprises entail encounter, but do all encounters entail surprise? That seems to be where it can be different. That seems to where it can be variance. And that's where different trainings can occur. Also, I think the point on you're saying there are different narratives that are better for some encounters than not, right? Like if you just took a Christianity, an Ivan Illich Christianity, emphasizing the man on the side of the road is better than a Roman road theology, right? Same umbrella, but one of them is much more insular, where the other one is all about an open narrative, right? But of course, the weird thing is you cannot will a surprise. A surprise, and we, you know, Ebert and I spoke about, you can't will a surprise. So you have to somehow ascribe to a narrative maintaining a certain openness to something that you can't directly plan without removing its power, that you nevertheless have to be prepared for to handle and to recognize. And what are the skills that go into that? You mentioned the word hegemony. As just a little side note, I've been very interested in, there's a man, I'm sure, Turgen, who does talk like overabundance of the elites, going through the history of like socio-political unities and like how hegemonies tend to create like like China. I've been comparing China with like mass education, then leading to like the laying class movement and different things. And it makes me think also one of the reasons why it's important to think broken hegemonies, because there is yet to be an example of hegemony that does not fall into a fourth turning scenario eventually, right? So this does actually have political economic ramifications if indeed hegemonic structures seem to have like they eventually have expiration dates. Now that's a giant can of worms you would have to go into, but they seem to either eat themselves alive or get invaded or something like that. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
I'm very giddy right now with this conversation. I have a shit ton to say. So okay. First, the knowledge outside of a narrative. I completely agree with you. I believe that there is also knowledge outside of a narrative, and to me, that's where like my book in terms of screenwriting is trying to come into play, because just a quick background, a lot of screenwriters get very much caught up in what's on the page, what's on the word, trying to make it work. And in that sense, they're very much stuck. The knowledge that they have is very much stuck in the world that they see on the paper, where my whole aim is to move away from that and to almost like there's the saying, like to kill babies, like to be a serial killer baby, basically, to just be willing to kill everything always. Nothing is fixed or certain that's on the page. That you're very much like oriented toward the theme, and that literally means that you're kind of not beholden to any one particular story that embodies that theme. So in that sense, it alludes to the possibility of thinking of possible stories, which means that you're not actually married to a particular story. So thinking outside of a narrative is essentially like in life. I think this is when philosophy comes in, very much so, because the philosophy throws one into questioning, which makes you see that what you're embodying is a possibility and it becomes in question. So having more basically thinking outside of a narrative is thinking thematically, insofar as you are thinking about what you will be embodying in terms of a possibility, which is very Heideggerian. I think so like when you are thinking purely outside of a narrative, there is no such thing. It's you're thinking in relation to a possible narrative. So it's kind of just shifting how one is oriented to what a narrative is, in that it's just not fixed. It's not a fixed narrative. There is no such thing as actually a fixed narrative. And then if you do think there is a fixed narrative, it self-effaces. It implodes on your face, and it's typically a shitty story, and typically the response is a page one rewrite. Typically. So the other thing, and I want to just tie this back to, I think it was like 2 nets ago when we were talking about other Daseins and stuff. The problem with having an understanding of Dasein in the sense that you can point to somebody else's Dasein means that you yourself see something in a fixed way. If you believe that you see China's Dasein, then you're not actually throwing your own positionality in relation to China into question. And that means you're in a short circuit if you're able to say someone else's Dasein. So the whole point to me of like Heidegger's Dasein is to just constantly put one in this thematic dimension where you're seeing other things in your world as possible things in your world, possible understandings in your world. So I just wanted to touch on that. And then with regards to the choice, it's funny where when you hear like, oh, you have to make a choice, it's not a choice in the colloquial sense of a choice. It's a choice where you either ignore, it's like something is calling to you. I'll be crude for a second. It's like something is calling to you and you either ignore it or not. That's the choice. What you're actually choosing isn't your choice. It was something that was bestowed onto you. That's where people might get caught up if they're listening when they're thinking about choice. You can't will the beatific vision. It's you, how you respond to the beatific vision is your choice. But it's always already in a response. So it's kind of putting the concept of choice in a different part in the process of becoming. It's basically secondary. It's always secondary and not primary. And I think nihilism comes into play when you shift in the process of becoming, choice being second to first. If you think choice is first, then nihilism will emerge. If you see choice as second in the process, then like it's almost like everything's amazing in the world in a certain sense. But it's like hard to kind of shift it from being second because phenomenologically you feel as if you feel phenomenologically you feel like it's not actually, you know, revealing itself to you. That's why like the concept of phenomenology is so late in the history of thinking, because it's like, sure, when I look at my kitchen, I see a set of knives over there. It's like, that's almost like so immediate. It's like, who gives a shit? It's like, what really matters in the colloquial world is like my ability to pick which knife, and if like the knife holder is appropriate enough for me to easily pick out of it. It doesn't even really matter about how it initially appears. So it's like so initial in the process of becoming that it gets easily overlooked and it gets easily diminished as not important. And then one more thing about the choice. So if we agree that the choice is the second thing, then I have, and this has to do with your conversation with Bard, because there was something that I disagreed with Bard. I wish I was taking notes, but I was like working out every time I was listening, so it was hard for me to actually take notes. But he was talking about just like the concept of like, not that there is no future, but it's everything is so past contingent. When you make a choice about it, it's not because you're making a choice where you know where it's going. That's the thing. Like you're making the secondary choice, if you will, in the process of becoming. You're making this choice, not know, like being well aware, not knowing where it's going. That you know it's going somewhere. That's the key. You know that it's going somewhere, but you don't know where exactly it's going. And I feel like human beings have the tendency to overstep that bounds where they're thinking that they know where it's going. So when someone says the future is open insofar it's going somewhere, but not somewhere particular that I have in my mind. So if that is the case, then I don't see, like, yes, the past and the future can be synthesized into the present moment, but like how you understand the past and the present and the future in relation to this choice, you can't make a distinguishment between past and future. So when I remember somewhere in the conversation, he was like saying something about it being like past emphasis, something like that sentiment, that to me is overlooking how you actually can't really distinguish between the past and the future. Like there's not a real distinguishment when you really take seriously that you're making a choice based off of something that's completely nonlinear. Like there is no beginning and end in a certain sense. It's like eternity in this particular sense of eternity where it has this static time in the present moment type of eternity. And then one more thing, to bring up the concept of like the dash in relation to this, because to me, this is where I feel like bounce and distance and that kind of stuff actually really makes sense. Where when you do get the beatific vision and you do make that choice, at that moment, when you make the choice, that's when the dash begins, the possibility of the dash in the concept begins to emerge. And then when you start thinking through the dialectical process, and you try to be faithful to the choice that you made with that dialectical process, that's when the subject and predicate, if you will, of the dash emerges into the actual concept. And for you to kind of fashion it into like having the subject and predicate fashioned into the dash, you have to use concepts like bounce and distance. You don't even have to call it that, but basically concepts where you realize how it's kind of just like if there's a subject, a predicate, and a dash, it's kind of going like this really fast. And that means you need particular psycho-technical perspectives that allow you to see something in this ecstatic, like this Heideggerian ecstatic temporality. Otherwise, the dash will collapse. The concept of the dash will collapse. And yeah, that I'll just finish it with that for now.
No, delightful. I mean, you could associate the dash with the oscillation of Nietzsche, and then you have to have a certain affirmation in that way. And Bard has a chapter in Process of Event talked about the negation to the oscillation. You could view the negation as the negation of the negation, bringing Hale together, or the idea that you are already in a story. And this is actually very important. Like to your point, like the idea of the choice is negated from you. And the negation of the negation then would be the affirmation in the Nietzschean sense of this story that then you are going to change this direction. And so I think you can bring that. I mean, if we take metaphysics as narratology, then to your point, if you're always in story, you're always in metaphysics. So there's only possible narrative, not no narrative, right? Well, that's the thrownness. You don't choose to be born, so you're already in narrative. And it's simply a question of your relation to that story, and that it's not fixed, right? You can treat it as fixed or not. And the negation is where you find yourself in something that could be fixed. You bring it to the oscillation to keep it from being fixed, but then you have to, in Nietzsche, affirm a direction, right? And I think also to what you were saying in the future, Bard will talk about the BPA, the virtual potential, and the actual. The past is actual, the present is potential. The present is potential because what is present around you can have causal impact on you, but the notion of the virtual is that it's extremely weak. Like your ideas of the future cannot necessarily have causal impact on you, right? You have to choose them, right? If I have a virtual idea of writing a short story, the virtual idea of writing a short story that doesn't exist it can't in of itself force me to do it. I can choose it. So this becomes a basis of kind of free will, right? Now, of course, you can say, well, if you didn't have the idea of the short story, you couldn't have then chosen it, right? Yes, but the question is like, what has the predominant causal influence on it? And in that example, it's like the virtual is something that really has to be willed, where the potential can have causal impact on you because it will compose the present moment in the actual. And and then what is potential is relative to what was actual, that is the past, that is an operation. And so those things kind of come together. And then I think the virtual in that sense, and then I'll give it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert, is going to be tied to the idea of keeping it from being fixed, right? Keeping it from being into that fixedness that can lead into self-effacement. So you have to keep it going. But of course, that becomes very difficult if you don't actually see this as the unfolding of a narrative, but where you're looking for the causer to have the theme that is found in the encounter, you're actually just going to be the virtual to stay within the ironic situation, like at the beginning of the book. You're never going to actually move. There's a way in which you require the virtual to move to the encounter where the causer can occur and the theme can arise. Right? Like you would never do that otherwise. And that's what's very interesting is that the causer almost seems like it has to be virtual, to use Bardian's idea. Like it's never going to occur in the potential because that's going to just be a continual unfolding of the actual, right? The virtual is a radically creative act in that sense, right? And it's also a radically free act, but the weirdness is the freedom emerges precisely when then you're called to consider something that you can't escape. Like that's the weird move. Like the virtual instantly moves into the actual, and then it becomes a determination that you have to operate according to. And so let me give it to Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Eber. Mr. Rivera.
I spent a lot of time thinking about the implicit negative connotations certain words have, like fixedness. And then something that Wynn said about that there's a knowledge outside of the narrative. I guess my question would be, what's the value for knowledge being outside the narrative? And if that answer is because we have to deal with the negativity of fixedness, that's another value that we are presupposing. This actually kind of reminds me of the talk I had with Ebert a while back about the sort of ironic tendency to embrace always becoming versus the stasis. And ironically, it's the stasis and the becoming, or whatever we want to call it, the tension, that interaction between the two that is actually the process. What I see or hear nothing of so far is the problem of the stasis. And with Luber's comment about the two choices, I would like for him to elaborate the interaction between the two, because right now, everyone operates operationally in the sense of the first choice, the fact that we are choosing our choices. But if you're advocating that we operate in the second ladder of the choice, where choice is bestowed and we don't know, wouldn't we have to promote a certain idea of actually them having a choice to choose such an option, right? Wouldn't that be kind of the thing? Go ahead, Luber.
So this is why I say, like, if you're a storyteller, you're kind of a liar a little bit. Because, like, to refer to, like, Daniel's, like, I think it's just great. The whole, like, wait, this is a hand, but it comes after me experiencing my hand. So, like, there is the pure experience first that you then have to delimit with language. And that's when I mean that how you choose to delimit it is the secondary choice. It's you realizing that what's happening first in the process of becoming and being is the pure experience, it's outside of language. That's why when I like tried Molly, I remember saying on the net, it's like, I know language isn't primary. It can't be primary because, like, at least when I was, high as a kite on Molly, I'm like, I'm not talking. It was just like pure immediacy and the feeling of me understanding the pure immediacy without using language. And it's hard for me to even talk about it. But yeah, I mean, the choice, and then real quick to answer the other part of what you're saying, the choice between, like, the two choices, like I'll give an example. Like, I think me and you are very similar in this respect, where it's like, yeah, philosophy kind of like called out to me and I chose to like respond to it. But now I'm feeling like I'm not going to respond to it. So I'm going to read a shit ton of literature and do other things that aren't directly relating. Like, it is relating to that calling out, but it's not like the label of philosophy. You're not doing philosophy when you're reading a book. It's like something different. But we're reading literature, it's something different. So like you can choose how to respond to it constantly, but the initial calling won't, like, that wasn't in your control, and that's akin to that pure experience in a certain sense. Like, what something calls out to you is the same as you just experiencing something, because you experiencing something is a constant calling out to you, and then you constantly have to respond and delimit that which is calling out to you. And it happens so fast that you overlook that initial part.
I mean, I imagine that in the animal world, this probably would be called just instincts, calling out. of something. But the fact that we're human beings, we use language and everything else, everything is basically mediated for us. We have to use calling out, but yeah, I mean, I want to talk more about, because I would say already in literary fiction, there is something like this already going on. I've been watching a lot of booktubers, and the way they define literary fiction, this is interesting, is that they assign it's a broad, ambiguous span of literature that has really no plot. It's plotless. And I know you've been trying to answer this for a while, Luber, about how a story is not quite. We can talk about stories because we've read stories, but it's hard to relate to our lives because it doesn't feel like a story. But I actually think that literary fiction is very close to what we would be talking about. It's plotless. It's a broken hegemony, as Thomas Wynne is saying, because literary fiction is not about the plot, ironically enough. It's about the characters. And this is what people spend a lot of time talking about. It's about the characters. So I think for me, if there is knowledge outside the narrative, the only knowledge outside the narrative is that there's no plot. And that's it. There's no plot. But I guess the question I have is like, what role does this, if there is knowledge outside the narrative, what role does this knowledge play in our belonging, or is it necessarily indifferent? Because I would like to even connect this to the innocence of becoming, because Thomas Wynne does allude that it seems to be merciful and bestowing, and that if it is, for me, that directly relates to that becoming has a sort of ignorance and innocence to it. But then that also would mean that it's perhaps maybe a little bit indifferent in a sort of merciful way. And I'm sort of taking away the connotation as indifference as a negative one. But I've also had thoughts about this idea. I actually have a talk I'm about to give for Julie's group next month. But I've been really questioning the negative connotations between giving up and surrendering or letting be. Because I think letting be, you have to do like a sort of double negation. Whereas giving up, you play with the negativity of the possession that someone already has, and you tell them, yes, just give up. Because giving up allows you to deal with the full negativity of it, and then you see that it wasn't ever yours in the first place. Because I think when someone starts talking about letting go, people start getting like a certain optimism in mind of just like, okay, if I let go, then good things will happen. Good things can emerge, which deters them. It almost blunts the negativity. And this is something I've been thinking about, that surrendering and letting go it leaves open the possibility of blunting the negativity. Whereas giving up, when someone is already fully immersed in their narrative and they've met a tragic consequence. Now, of course, the idea of giving up doesn't even guarantee that they will fully realize it either. Same thing with, I would say, surrendering or letting be. But I think for me, sometimes with people already, it's a way of lying, I would say. Telling people to give up is a way of lying. And saying that there is no knowledge outside the narrative is also a way of lying, because then it tells them that there's nothing else for them to look for. That their narratives is just a plurality of narratives amongst other narratives, and there's nothing else. And when you do this lie, you force them to give up. They encounter a sort of tragic enamorment. And of course, the risk we all pose is a sort of, maybe depressed nihilism or something. But eventually they'll have to give that up too. And I think, I don't know, I mean, for me, this is the alternative route, a more tragic one, but it plays with the negativity. in a more brutal way, versus, you know, these more semi-optimistic ways of like letting be, letting go, because a lot of people find hope in that. It's not wrong or anything. I don't think it's wrong, but I do think it only works with particular types of people. I think telling some people to give up could be brutal, but it also could be the only way they end up understanding anything. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think a lot also on this notion of stories, character, like plot. There's an interesting thing in which the plot, as in being what a character starts in, actually then the story, following Mr. Lieber's work, and I think is correct, is precisely in the encounter with the causer that then forces the character to change themselves. And what's very interesting is that there's a way in which the plot is not something in which the character is fit in. It is the kind of recalling of the reader of what the character did in response to the situation they found themselves in, which then retrospectively makes it seem like, oh, that was the plot. But actually, to the character themselves, it was a unfolding of decisions based on things that were thrown at them that then creates retrospectively a kind of impact, a kind of narrative structure that the author could have known. But this is what's very interesting, is then the question is, how does the subject experience in their life narrative? It's almost like you experience choice. You experience choices that then you can think about narratively and maybe guide your, then you have, like we're using the past as the actual, you can maybe guide your choices based on the unfolding of the narrative. But if you're at the edge of the narrative, there's always kind of a choice that you're making, which gets into discernment, ethics, character, and all of these different things, right? And it's almost like if you're looking for a plot to do your decisions for you as a human being, well, that would be externalized, and that would be kind of problematic. And one of the issues is, like you brought up this point of when is fixed, you know, there are times fixedness is good, fixedness is bad, hope can be good, hope can be bad. It's almost like the issue is, if we follow Hegel, where everything entails its contradiction, everything could entail its contradiction, right? So it's almost like hope becomes a plot independent of the character, right? Or the letting go can become a plot independent of the character. The issue is that it seems like we cannot make the decisions of which to do outside the encounter, outside the hitting of the limit, and outside the causer. Like if you're trying to have a kind of plot, oh, humans should always hope, humans should always let go, humans should always like not let go. All of these kind of functions as plot independent of the choices of a character that then lead to bad fiction, right? So there is something here that's very interesting, because when you look at good stories, good literature has some sort of radical encounter at the heart of it, what Lieber calls the causer. It's the Quentin and Benji seeing Caddy up in the tree. It's Hamlet seeing their father. It's Othello being told that, you know, with Iago, right? There's this bam, and then the plot is the decisions of the character that surprises them, actually. And that's where a lot of the power is, which of course is the plot, but from the perspective of the character, they're not thinking of themselves in a plot. They're thinking of themselves as making choices relative to the causer, right? And that's, I think, a different framing that then can help us over, because otherwise we just spend philosophy looking for plots, right? What's the plot? Oh, you know, beauty could be a plot if you're not careful. But then it falls into the collapsing of the good and the beautiful, right? You could turn lack into a plot, but then it's actually just a notion independent. Every single concept, because it entails its potential otherness, runs the risk of becoming a plot without the character. How do you avoid that risk? By making central the encounter, which would be the clearing, which would be the grace of error, you know, the grace of error, as we were saying last week. And then I'm also interested, I'll pass it to Ebert here and then Mr. Wynn, is there's also something, if we look at what Ebert was saying with the Overton window, on if there's something about moving the narrative, like that you're always in a narrative and you take an extreme position to move things over. It's funny there where you're actually making a choice, like to take an extreme position, that's actually moving the plot versus making a choice in a plot. Like if you take the Overton window seriously, that almost is a kind of political corollary to the notions of making choices to move the plot into the choice, as opposed to just making choices within the window. Therefore, the window always kind of takes you over. Now, it's a different topic, but it was something I was thinking about, but I appreciate what you were saying. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn and Mr. Jockin. Mr. Ebert, I hope you are doing well today, sir. Oh, he fell. Oh, no.
Yes.
Oh, no. We lost him. Oh, gosh. So well, Mr. Ebert, wherever you are, I hope that you feel that. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn and Mr. Jockin. Mr. Wynn.
Just like the start of a comment quickly, like losing the plot. I think in England it's a very common saying. Like if somebody's lost the plot, it means they're crazy. Like literally, it means like if someone, especially because here, like you have allotments and you have your plot on the allotment. And I think when someone loses the plot, it just means they've gone like crazy. It's like a way to say it. And I don't know if in the US it's the same. Obviously not. Because on the chat when I put like broken hegemonies equals losing the plot, in my head I was laughing. Because it's like something that normally within our society we see as a negative. Like if you lose the plot, you've lost out. Like the plot's where you grow your vegetables, you know. But I think this is the point. Like, and just a question quickly, Luba, like where are these quotations from? From Schelling or Heidegger's?
This is Heidegger on what's the book called? I'm so shitty with names. Schelling's Human Freedom Trustee. Heidegger wrote a book. Here, let me look it up. But here, sorry.
Okay. No, it's fine. Yeah, just because I was reading it when, just because I was waiting. I think this is the question. Like, this is the fundamental question for me, and it always comes back to how is it we experience our plot? Like, is the plot for me a subjective interpretation? Like, what do I think grounds my experience? Like, is it God? Is it being? Is it life? Is it myself? Is it the subject? Is it my reason? Is it my interpretation? Like, what is it that I think gives my truth certainty? Yeah. Like what makes my truth true in a sense? And I think this is what we're kind of coming back to. And I think this is why I said at the beginning, like the Luba's understanding of this idea of like the dialectics of narratives and stuff like this. I think that's a very it's the way of understanding philosophy today, which I think is growing in importance. Like we understand that the way that we understand things is historically given in some sense, you know, like historical epochs emerge and then they change and they reform themselves. But what is it that lies underneath? Like, what is it that guarantees the certainty of each historical narrative? Like some people would say, well, the narrative itself is like an evolutionary thing. The logic coheres with reality, and that's all we need to know, you know? It's like a very rationalist perspective. But I think this is the point, like, what's the task of philosophy? I have a friend who's reading the move from Descartes to Leibniz, and Leibniz is saying that we don't need objectivity in aesthetics. We don't need to understand what something in itself is. Beauty is ordained by God. We don't have to correctly understand it. We can just experience it outside of objective knowledge. Whereas Descartes was like, no, like we need to objectively understand it. Otherwise, it's not there. It's subjective. And I think this is the thing, like how do we approach that thing which seems to be more than just our idea? I think there is a way to understand our plot, our shared plot, which has truth. If you asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said, no, everything's subjective, but that's quite a nice experience. Like that opens up freedom, that opens up like the beauty in some way, but we can't determine it. So let's just stick with the narrative. Now I think there are ways of thinking or being with experience which doesn't have to even stick with this idea of narrative. I think, and this is Heidegger's point, like that the essence of thinking is poetical. And I think this came up before when Luba's been in the conversation, like poetical thinking, and that kind of then means like narrative. Like, and even what Heidegger would call poetry is like Hölderlin with the steeple blue, the church in the sky. That's a narrative. It's a way to understand the church, but it's not trying to describe it. It's trying to open up the freedom of that experience, like the bird flying overhead, you know? And it's not trying to give like an objective or accurate correspondence to reality. It's trying to show you your place within the historical world, understood through a historical narrative, but approaching experience in a different way where you encounter truth within the narrative. And I think this is how, but then like, I think this even Jockin, when we started talking about the non-compelled compeller, and I remember you saying like, you get to this part of philosophy, which is like approaching the beautiful, aware that it's good or its narrative isn't sufficient enough. And you start to approach it and you get to this moment where you're like, oh, how do we think beauty, or how do we think being? How do we think the ground? And I think the silence that starts to creep in, I don't think it's tragedy. I don't think it's negativity. I don't think it's like nothingness. I think that's how then we start to understand it. Like, oh, The reason why I can't understand truth is because I'm barred. I'm split, you know, I am like this. I think it's more to do with the fact that the type of knowledge we start to go into encounters with isn't sufficient for the surprise, because we still want to know it objectively. We still want to grab hold of it in some way. And I think truth today lies in this perspective which says we can only encounter truth when we let that experience be. And we can go into it with that knowledge. And that type of knowledge is different. That type of knowledge has more certainty. And then I would say that's the question. Is that still a narrative? Is that still an interpretation? Or is that something which enters a different type of knowledge in some way? You know, like poetical knowledge or... Yeah, I did want to make another point, but I'm going to stop here just because this is where my brain keeps getting to tonight. But even my brain is not sufficient, you know, because what's the difference between my brain and being? I am being, you know, I am. As Christ himself said, I am, you know.
There you go. No, I appreciate Mr. Wynn. I'll pass it to Jockin, Javier, and Mr. Lubin. And Mr. Ebert comes back. We'll throw him in, I think. But it's very interesting because I think often, what is the difference between a historic account and a chronicle? What's the difference between counting and listing? There seems to be an issue here. Similar, like when is life a story? There's a way in which maybe when we say life is narrative, it's actually more of a chronicle. Like we would call it as a listing of facts. In order for a account, like in order to have history, this is from Hayden White. For history to be history, it has to be literature, basically. Otherwise, it's just a chronicle. It's a list. Well, I'll use Leibniz. The difference between listing and counting is the carrying a quality. There's a quality you're carrying, right? Like the reason you count these apples with 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apples is because you see a shared quality that makes it counting as opposed to listing, right? So likewise, a story seems to be some sort of choice or actions that maintains a quality through time. And it's almost as if it's almost like you require virtue in order to make a chronicle. You could almost say the unvirtuous life, the life that doesn't make choices, a chronicle or a list of events that then retrospectively, because it's sequential, has an appearance of a story, but really it might be more of a chronicle. I'd have to think about this. In order for something to be a story, there has to be a sharing, like a carrying of quality over time. But how do you know what quality is? You need the causer. You need the encounter. You need the theme. Otherwise, you don't know what quality to keep choosing in order to sublate the chronicle of your life into a narrative, right? So maybe what's outside of plot is a chronicle, a listing without shared quality, which is not necessarily bad. No one's saying that, but maybe that's something to think. And really the issue for why stories that leave characters behind tend up not even being good stories is because you don't have an active choosing of a quality to carry through the events to unify them into a story. It actually just becomes a chronicle, if you will. So you need that character. Mr. Wynn, please.
I'm just reading a quote. It's from the book Poetry, Language, Thought. I can't remember the lecture of it from Heidegger, but basically he says this exact same point. It's like, but in this sense, like, you can think of narratives as constructions, like human constructions, shared projects, shared constructions. And in a way, I think this is what Heidegger says with cultivating. You have cultivation. So I think this is probably building, dwelling, thinking, the text. You have construction, narratives, projections onto things, positings, presuppositions, principles, laws, you know, everything that we as human beings think and place onto things. But then you have cultivation. And I think cultivation is a word to understand how it is that we dwell within those historical narratives. And here there's a quote saying, like, how is it then that we let things present themselves? Or how is this done? He says, in this way, that mortals nurse and nurture the things that grow, which means being there for surprises, letting those surprises grow, nurturing them, opening up the space to be surprised, and especially construct things that do not grow. Cultivating and construction are building in the narrower sense. Dwelling, so then like this is how we relate, but then more importantly, dwelling insofar as it keeps or secures what he then calls the fourfold in things. And I think this is the point, like, I think Heidegger never disregards any aspect of human experience to the point that we can actually affirm the historical narratives. We can, the necessarily like Nietzschean life affirmation, we can affirm life, we can affirm the narratives, and then we can have the freedom and joy in a way to say, well, this narrative makes me more aware of the fact that life gives me things. Let's cultivate that. Let's open up spaces. Let's open and let's break those hegemonies that don't open up spaces. You know, like let's take away that will to technology that closes surprises, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that freedom to know that you can actually affirm language, you can affirm narrative, means that then Luba can write a book, you know? It means that we can write things, we can play the piano techniques and everything like this, you know? I think there's something there about this nursing and nurture the things that grow, like giving space in some sense.
No, I think that's lovely. I mean, what it makes me think is it's almost like a story requires a character holding a quality through time, which is virtuous, but you can't know what the quality is you need to hold without encounter of the other. And the other is precisely hard to encounter. And maybe a tragedy is where you lose the quality, because the encounter of the other then puts the call of the theme on your life that commands you to hold a quality. Tragedy is losing the quality. Comedy is keeping the quality over time. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Javier, Mr. Luba. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, good conversation. I'm enjoying this. I'm going to be a little contrary on this point about this issue of choosing to lie, for example. Okay, so there's a to get a little pedantic, not to get pedantic, but there's a difference between basically a lie of omission versus an active introduction of a lie. So what I mean by that is, under that, because you know why? Because I would say logos, accounts, or because things have a diversity of accounts of logi that they participate in and could attune to. That does not mean just because you choose one logos versus another does not mean you're lying per se. It means that there's a choice of which account you're using. So, for example, when Aristotle makes a comment that the circle is being used by the geometer and the carpenter, they're both encountering and using the circle, they get different accounts. We would not say they're lying. So I do think there's a distinction here about active, intentional, adding a falsity to claims versus an accusation of omission, which the choice of which account you're using will do. This relates to history. So, for example, the idea that an account, like every choice of what events you're going to present is a choice. That's not a lie per se. That's a choice to draw forth certain events or certain circumstances. So just that, so that's, I think that just on a notion of history, I'm reminded of that. Now, with that said, which accounts you use activate certain natures of reality are presented versus others. So I think that is really true. And I think that's actually, I just bring that up because even the distinction here really is, I guess, one that's the issue of, do the narratives that are presented in fiction, do they point to a higher reality? I only see this in poetics. There's an exact point about this. The difference between history and poetry is that poetry is actually more universal. It points to basically theme, they use Luber language, kind of themes or archetypes, or more universals than a particular history accountings are about individuals. So I'm chewing on that. So I'm just chewing on that point. Another part, as opposed in the chat with poetics, is that drive of thought and character to move action. Those are the things. I think what we're getting at here is when there's a plot that overpowers the characters. It kind of like, they're basically NPCs. They're just like, they're NPCs in the sense that they're being operated on by a necessity of an artificial plot, as opposed to being the organic generation through conflict, strife, of usually conflict of competition of desires, usually just something in contention that the characters are in conflict about. That's what drives the plot. That's a distinction versus the other way. I think there's another note, just kind of chewing on this. I brought in the beginning of the net here, this idea of, I think I've talked to Luber about this personally, the idea of, pain is a sign of lack, but it does not entail all lacks. There are some lacks that can be existent without pain. And I remember you read some Aristotle on this point, an idea of evils of wickedness and folly can be present without awareness, like without pain. They can exist. And part of the learning process is to be striked to realize those things, to kind of realize something you were ignorant about. So I'm just chewing on that, a part of the educational development process. So I'm chewing on that. So I guess my main tension part is, one is the nature of use of lying, right? To generate, it's like I have a tension about that. But I do think the kind of working through of intelligibility, right, is through character generation, right? And through this kind of like kind of operation of what accounts we choose to derive out and what tensions come up from that. I think it is quite interesting. Because I see Javier's point is not of a lack of non-ether symmetry, but we belong in our alienation. You know, I kind of like, yeah, I want to hear Javier's kind of reflection about that. So I'm going to stop now.
No, I'll give it Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Luber if you want to speak. I think I'm also just thinking as a quick note of this interesting dilemma of where we find ourselves as human beings judging the quality that we're going to carry to make a story, where when you read Othello, the causer, like the writer, Shakespeare kind of creates the situation of the causer that then almost in a way determines the quality that Othello has to choose if he's going to hold to or not. And that ambiguity of your position in life might be something that's tied to this alienation feeling of kind of oscillating between having the causer done for you, but arranging your life to encounter the causer. Are you the character? Are you the writer? Et cetera, so forth. There would be more to think, but it was just thinking on that. But let me give it to Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
I think plots fundamentally are rooted in the idea of suffering. That if everyone had the same plot, if everyone believed in the same plot, it would fundamentally ease or eradicate suffering to whatever degree we're looking at. So now we're left with another issue where we have these multiplicity of narratives, competing narratives, that all promise or willing to promise a certain easement of suffering. And the way we depict other narratives is that they would perhaps increase suffering, which shares our disagreement about them. But to me, I look at it like the same thing as anybody else, which is it's about suffering. Now, the one thing about Nietzsche that always stuck in my mind was that he talked about the intelligibility of suffering, like it's so unintelligible, precisely because when you commit an action, you can't even precipitate the amount of hurt or damage it could cause to something or someone. When I thought about this more, I said, this is why people flounder back all the time, and they say, "Go, that wasn't my intention. That wasn't what I meant to happen." And it's precisely this pain and the suffering that is so unintelligible that we are driven to understand it. We want to make it intelligible to ourselves. And in our desire to make it intelligible to ourselves, we construct a plot. There must be one. If not, it doesn't make any sense. And if it doesn't make any sense, then, and this goes back to like the whole pessimism, optimism debate. Why should I prefer existence over non-existence? But then you see, that there's a lot of ironies in both cases, preferring and not preferring. But anyways, so what I've gathered about narratives and plots is that they're also centered around belonging, fundamentally, right? Because it doesn't make any sense to shout out your narrative unless some people in some sense agree with it and you feel less alienated by it. And I think this is what's interesting about the truth, is that the truth, and I don't even care about it subjectively or objectively, but I look at it in the sense of like, people want truth because there seems to be a sense of belonging if there is a sense of truth, if there is a sense that we can connect with. Because actually, even if we could get to the knowledge behind that narrative, to me, it would make little difference if it didn't actually allow belonging to occur. There would be no point in saying that there was knowledge outside of the narrative if it didn't allow belonging to occur. So that's when I say, is it as important to actually know the truth outside the narrative versus what it already gives you and allows you, which is the sense of belonging? But then we catch ourselves in this other idea, which is perhaps we must wonder where consciousness decides to exceed itself and becomes a torturous mechanism of itself because it so desperately wants to know, versus perhaps what it's actually aimed towards, which is simply the idea of cultivating. Like like Wynn was saying, the idea of cultivating what was given. But I would also like to propose the other idea of cultivating, which is cultivating things that perhaps would disturb us or are not intelligible, which I'm particularly thinking of, like the care that happens in like hospice care, you know? There's a certain idea of omission that is happening. Like the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I'm not sure if we have actually, but the one thing I don't hear enough about sometimes is the aftercare that might be needed for somebody's narrative that has been broken, right? Because in some sense, it is like a death, and it is sort of like treating somebody in a hospice, because like there's really nothing you can do to convince them that there is something else. Like that narrative, they wouldn't call that a narrative. That was their life, you know? So it would seem a little bit too cruel to even say, this is just a narrative for you. I promise you there's other narratives, and you can affirm life this way. But we would never say that out loud, because if we said that out loud, they would say, this is not a game. This is my life. I believe this. So we have to omit, and maybe, maybe like this is my version of saying lying. We have to omit saying this to another being. And all we can do is, in some sense, be there, which is a weird way of cultivating, ironically, because there's nothing you can really do. You have to sort of let the narrative decay on its own. And so what does it mean to really care for somebody that's dying? How do we care for a narrative that's dying? I think would be the question that I pose. How do we care for narratives that are dying? Because as much as we talk about how do we deal with the fact that the narratives are always changing, beings, as varied as they are, they have trouble with the fact of dealing with the care that involves the perpetual change of narratives. Because you either have a couple of options, right? You can always say that my narratives doesn't matter because the narratives will always change. But then that raises the question of that you're never allowed to cultivate anything precisely because it will change. So it doesn't actually matter to cultivate anything. And so you start living in a world of indifference. But it would seem that belonging together, knowing that narratives change, and caring in that way for dying narratives might be a way to belong. But I would say it fluctuates. These narratives would be tragic, they could be comedic, they could be hopeful, and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think I think that's usually what I mean when I tell my partner, like, there's certain things or like philosophical concepts that would, if I were to say them out loud, right, they might destroy your world, mainly because it's not that I have some power to destroy the world, but it's because they are thoughts that would make you question everything about reality that you know, and perhaps you're not ready to do all those things. And that's one way. That's one way to flirt. Yeah. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, those are outstanding. So a few things it makes me think. I'll pass to Mr. Lugo and Mr. Wynn. So my beloved William Wilson always said that the key to good literature is that it doesn't pour it in from the top. Meaning that what occurs in the story is always internally consistent with the logic that is there, that is realized through time. And like one of the ways he would judge, say, he would actually argue that A Good Man is Hard to Find was one of Flannery O'Connor's worst stories, even though it's one of her most famous, because it's poured in from the top. There's a coincidence where they encounter and the story moves. Most story writers operate by pouring in from the top. They add a event or a coincidence or something that then makes the plot keep moving. That's actually what often occurs in suffering, where we have some, well, let me pour some meaning in from the top, right? And that's actually going to be bad literature, where the reaction to suffering or getting somewhere in the plot where you don't know where to go or what does it mean, because suffering destroys meaning, is to then pour in from the top. But here's the problem. It's too late then. Like it can't be good literature. You have to be prepared for it, right? So also there's the issue where there's a way in which meaning, the word meaning is so tricky, because you look for, there's meaning pouring in from the top, and then there's meaning of being heroic and facing the death or facing the unfolding of the logic or the inevitable death that occurs, right? And there's a way in which you could almost, although I'm not sure how I would hold to this language and have it, there's almost a difference between heroic and meaning, where meaning in one sense, or it could be a distinction if we're not careful, right? Where there's a meaning of, oh, I face this suffering, let me pour something from the top to make it meaningful, right? Where there's a kind of heroic meaning or a virtuous meaning that is, here's suffering, I'm ready for the encounter, and I'm not going to look away from the hospice, right? That would be good literature, but that's really hard. And in a way, a good story writer actually sets up, this is what's weird, they set up a situation for the sake of the character, not for the character to fit in, but a situation when that logic is calls to kind of spring in, the character is then pulled along to give it an opportunity to be heroic. And it's almost like, instead of meaning, in that circumstance, it's a question of was life tragic or comic? Comic in a sense of like elevated, did it elevate into the beautiful or did it fall? Did you lose the quality or not? And it's interesting because in a sense, that's the question of meaning, but it's also a different kind of meaning from simply the meaning of I'm somewhere in the plot, I can't make sense of what's going on. Okay, let's have the misfits show up, right? So the logic of good storytelling, I think, also speaks to this issue, where very often meaning is poured in from the top. And that then, and also you could say a lot of belonging is poured in from the top. And that's why we talk about givens. And basically now belonging again has to be in the encounter. It has to be from the unfolding logic that then means it's in the heroic act of being able to be there in the hospice, the after death. Because another way to put this, if you tell your girlfriend something that destroys your worldview, you're pouring in the deconstruction from the top. That's the problem. It's not emerging from their own life narrative that then you're there to meet them in. Like, that's the problem with nihilists. Like, they say, well, life is meaning, let me destroy your Christian beliefs. Let me destroy your atheism, whatever. You're actually pouring the change from the top as opposed to dwelling with them to be in a faithful presence for the possibility of unfolding the logic, to help them have encounters so that then they can, in the surprise of those encounters, undergo the change by the logic of their own narrative through the encounter, right? So that's the problem. Most of the time, and this actually, dang it, would fit with the cultivating. There you go. Exactly. Most belonging has been basically pouring in from the top versus cultivation. Like, all of history has been this. But now with pluralism, global pluralism, and these technologies, a belonging of encounterology, of narrative that is in an unfolding logic, because encounters are now of otherness are now more probable for the average person. So a belonging of cultivation becomes more possible for the average person because encounters with otherness are easier now. And in that ease are also, that means anxiety is easier, but that anxiety is precisely evidence of the possibility of greater encounter in which otherness can be hit, theme can happen, and then you could have story unfold. But really, the great problem is basically most of what people do is a pouring in from the top version of the thing. And if it's ever pouring in from the top, it doesn't work. Hope pouring in from the top doesn't work. Virtue pouring in from the top doesn't work. It's just more like moral premises, like meaning poured in from the top. If it's poured in from the top, it doesn't work in the proper way. It's almost like rain that slides off. Mr. Rivera, please.
Is it, the question I have is it our responsibility if we're the ones that are capable of realizing this to some degree? Because I imagine that not everybody that is being fed from the top or already captured in a narrative would understand, would be able to do this precisely because they are within the narrative. But if we're the ones witnessing this, and I guess there's a sort of irony in this too, because I'm not sure, and I'll be interested to see what you think. Because it almost seems like it's not. I'm hesitant to call it responsibility rather than it's something I do with my bestowing of this realization. That's all. Yeah.
No, it's actually quite the responsibility is in knowing this to then do the patience of the concept of faithful presence, to be there if people choose to absolutely choose to relate to you in the point of their story where they have encountered the command, and then if they follow the theme to be there for you. You are not, it is not your responsibility to pour in from the top. That actually doesn't work. That's bad. It is your responsibility to be a good storyteller. Basically, it is your responsibility not to be a bad storyteller per se. But here's the problem. It is not obvious what is a good story and what is a bad story, right? That's why we need Mr. Luber's book and like the Heideggerian and virtue and a recover of beauty. In a way, I am quite sympathetic to Bard saying metaphysics is narratology. Like there's something narrative about it. It's not, he's not saying fake, but it's inseparable from questions of phenomenology, virtue, strike, and different things, right? He wants to move into like that kind of thing, right? Rather that language is too strong or not, that's a different matter. But there's something about basically what has happened is philosophy is like, we need to know how to tell good stories. And our responsibility is to be good storytellers, which means you can't pour from the top. So it does have more of a dwelling, a faithful presence. But it's like we were saying last week, you have to get really good at capacities that there's no promise you'll ever use. So an example that came up last week, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn, is Jockin was telling the story of when he had to give a presentation at a college and he gets there and the sound system's not good or the room is not available. So they have to go to a bar, and they go to the bar and he's like, oh, it's going to be, you know, reserved so we can tell the story. And you get there and actually, no, it's full business. Everything's going on and it's kind of a mess, right? And yet he still gives the presentation, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm not going to do this because it's no good. You encounter an error, but because you built the capacity of being able to project your voice or present, you're able to use that in that circumstance. But actually the trick is there. You're not using the capacity to show it off. You had the capacity to be ready for a situation like this. So then you could rise to the occasion and do something memorable and powerful, right? I think it's actually something like that. I think the responsibility of philosophers is to gain capacities that then they are holding to where if a situation arises where those capacities can be shown without showing off, then you do it. But that means you actually have to run the risk of learning and gaining capacities that you may never use, which of course will then tempt you to show them off. We made a distinction last week between showing and showing off. The only way to show capacities and it be part of the story and not poured in from the top, but part of the logic, is for the encounter of the error, the encounter of the break, the encountering of the surprise of the person who's then open to it. And you then have the capacity to meet them. And then you may never, ever use the capacity again. You have to be willing to do that. There's a great risk in the building of virtue and capacity. And then also there's always this tradition of doing things for themselves, like doing useless things or goods for their own sake. All of this would suggest that these philosophical capacities are things that you may choose to pour a whole lot of time in and never, ever use them. That's an extraordinary risk. And thus you must see good in of themselves for their own sake, that there's a goodness in doing that, even if you never use them. And there's something, and that's almost the power that has to be behind a narrative for a story to unfold. Like that is the creating of the situation, that if the causer hits, then the story unfolds. Like it is the holding of that capacity. And you could almost say that today's world, we have the counterfeit of technological standing reserve, of which we have then sacrificed the holding of virtuous capacity to show in the encounter of error. It's almost like we've traded that kind of capacity of virtue for the technological standing reserve, and that creates all sorts of problems, right? But there's this real issue. I think it's our responsibility. The way I think about it is it's our responsibility to know what a story is, because if you don't know what a story is, you don't know how to use these capacities, right? It's to be in that faithful presence, to participate in the unfolding and people come to you, but it's actually extraordinarily painful, because you can't force people into that place. And you may hold a capacity that you never use, even if you saw it may have helped someone, so you wanted to accelerate it. The logic of the story would not allow it without it being pouring from the top, therefore breaking the story, therefore self-effacing. This requires extraordinary discernment and judgment and dwelling and risks and sufferings. But I think timing, there you go, your philosophy of timing. This is all remarkably difficult. But I think that's a way I would think about it. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn, Mr. Luber, and then back to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Wynn.
Go to what Javier said, like, I think this is the interesting part again, because it depends on, so the question is like the risk of degrounding someone's narrative. Yeah. I think this is always the seed of doubt that I think exists, even if you think that being is the letting, which is graceful, la la la. There's always the seed of doubt that actually being is not that. Being is actually in itself negativity, nothingness, God, positivity, love, etc. I think if we try to sustain like an accurate representation of it, it's like trying to confront beauty. I think you'll always find this kind of impossibility. And I think, again, this is where postmodern philosophy it became intelligent enough to realize that it cannot approach being through wanting to grab hold of it. So in its place, it posited nothingness. And I think this is where we stop. So I think that question of like, oh, what are we, how can we talk about, I think, well, how did you frame it? You said like, the aftercare of a narrative being destroyed. I think because of the way that we treat, and this is, I think, the epochal narrative, and I think this is what Heidegger's good. He's good at drawing out like the kind of bigger modern metaphysical narrative that we still live within. It's not just the personal narratives that we choose to make sense of our place within a specific culture at a specific time, like, you know, the 2020s instead of the 2010s. It's actually like the bigger presuppositions behind modern metaphysics in that sense. I think the idea is like modern metaphysics has led to the meaning crisis, to this presupposition which sees impossibility as the sign or symbol for nothingness, you know? And I think this is my experience of anxiety, panic attacks, is like I'm presupposing in those moments the nothingness of life, the nothingness of being. And I come away and I had, for example, like a personal thing, like I was away for the month, and the second night I was away, I had a panic attack for the first time in 10 years. In that moment, I said to myself, like, I know that this experience does not, which seems true, it feels real. This in itself, like, I have to be skeptical about this to know that this negativity is not the truth of being shining through, and my narratives just conceal this lack, you know? And when I recognized this, the beauty, like I woke up the next morning and like the sun rose and it was very nice. I could hear the sea, I could breathe. I was like, oh, this in itself, even if I'm now using my poetical narrative to understand this has more truth in some sense. But there's always that seed of doubt. And I think the modern condition leads us to question where we feel anxious for other people and for ourselves when the ground starts to, the plot, when we lose the plot, basically. Because I've encountered like these moments of madness, like a panic attack is a moment of madness, actually. I think that's the definition of it. You're losing your ground and you're trying to resubstantiate yourself upon something. But because that fails, because it's a very modern way to do it, like, oh, who am I? No, I need to know. Like, so part of the attack was like for 20 seconds, because it was so hot. I couldn't work out where I was or who I was for 20 seconds. That's not good. I had lost the plot, literally lost the plot in that precise sense. But then I started to come around and I worked out, oh God, like I'm really hot in this tiny tent, etc. Then I could narrativize it again. So maybe someone would come along and say, oh, maybe the truth of being is confusion and nothingness and suffering and pain. And you're just using your narrative to cope with the world, you know? And I think that's a very common, unconsciously common idea that we have, I think, about life. But I think, again, this is why it goes back to the question of being. How is it that not just particularly or singularly you experience being, but is there a truth to being? And I think this is why for Heidegger, or not even Heidegger, he just introduces the question of being and he comes up with a very interesting response. But the question of being is always there. Like, what is it that we think lies beneath or below or within the error, basically? And I think a lot of the optimism with the net, and I think why it is good philosophy, is with the framing of is around the beauty, you know, and of course suffering, and of course lack, and of course, and that's good philosophy, is when it can incorporate all of the questions and it's not afraid to talk about lack or nothingness. Or is it then, I think this is the point, it's not afraid to talk about letting be or beauty, because letting be is a trust of being or of life, that it can give you an experience which actually says something truer, phenomenologically perhaps, more than the simple narratives we give to it, you know? And I think this is my point, because I typed in the word belong on my notes. And all I wanted to say at the beginning, I wasn't going to use that example, but maybe there are two types of belonging. One is to belong to kind of a degrounding or a groundlessness, or even belonging to losing the plot, which means being susceptible to it or being aware of it. And again, this goes to the early Heidegger with anxiety, the mood of anxiety, being towards death. It's a similar kind of placing into the position of the readiness of surprise in some sense. And then I think the ability to belong, maybe there are three, like the belonging to groundlessness, the belonging to be able to live within narratives, knowing the groundlessness, and that's very Nietzschean in some sense. And I think this is the third belonging, and I think this is what Heidegger calls like the belonging to truth. He calls it a belonging to being, and if he understands in these last years that being is the letting, the gracefulness of the letting, that then means that we can dwell, because we understand that being actually is very graceful. And those moments that it doesn't seem graceful, that we find pain, that we find suffering, are perhaps, and this is a question for me, because of narratives where we assumed that we could hold on to things and they fall apart or they slip away, you know? And maybe that's the point. I think if you belong to what he calls the fourfold, which is like the earth, the sky, the divinities, it's also the fourth, mortality. So you can belong to finitude in that sense. You can belong to the finitude of narratives, actually, and affirm it and say, actually, I can also affirm this narrative. And I just want to read one quote. I think it's from a later small article called Art and Space. It's like 5 pages long. I would really recommend it. It talks about poetical thinking, poetry, to go back to what Jockin said. He says first, and he talks about making room, like the person who sculpts is actually making room by taking away from the rock. He says first, making room admits something. It lets something come forth. It lets openness hold sway, which, among other things, grants the appearance of things present to which human dwelling sees itself consigned, like belonging. On the other hand, making room prepares for things the possibilities to belong to their relevant whither, like destiny, and out of this to each other. And I think this is the point, like making room, degrounding, undoing. I think that the faith has to come in that, and again, it's subjective, because this person, for example, I know many people that if they started to deground some of their narratives of their life, they would probably suffer in that sense. And that is the point, like practically within the age, yes, we will suffer. But I think that's the only thing, is to recognize without that kind of slipping away, how can you glimpse being as beauty or beauty as being, or, you know? And I think that's the impossibility, but that's the risk, I think. Yeah. You can't belong, I think, unless you have that initial groundlessness, I think, in some way.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Luba, Javier, and Jockin. I would say that letting is the opposite of pouring, and that if you're pouring, you're not letting. So most of the time what we've done in history is poured, hope, meaning whatever, not let, right? So, but the issue is you can only let at the, here's the issue. Letting occurs at the causer. So you have to dwell into the patient's, like there's a real way where true stories start where the plot fails. That's what's weird. Most people think that a good story is the plot, but actually a good story is when a causer occurs that then breaks the plot. You're living in the shower, you have your life, you're free, and there's a breaking of what you thought was the plot. And it actually turns out that the plot was keeping you from the causer, ergo why irony is central to literature, and I also think to life, right? But really, like what I mean by that is, for me, like on this idea to Javier's question of do you unground people or do you constrict or you break up their narrative? The way I think about it is that if I've been ungrounded, let me talk about doubt, because maybe doubt would be it. If I'm experiencing doubt, then the world must be unfolding in a manner that made me experience doubt. So I don't need to pour it onto them because the world they are in is unfolding doubt, right? Like it is in the world that is occurring, right? And there is something that is unfolding that I need to let be and let unfold, and then be faithfully present to that process and resist the temptation to pour, so that then when the people in that unfolding come to me or you encounter them, then you're actually not deconstructing, you're actually working with, you're dwelling with them in the hospice per se. Another way to think about this, when you go to hospice, the people aren't giving you cancer to be in hospice. They're treating you with cancer, right? Like if you give people like doubt and deconstruction, you're then treating them for the thing that you gave them, right? What's interesting about hospice is you are treating people from all of their unique circumstances that have gotten cancer, and you're dwelling with them in that cancer. I think something similar actually is the correct way to think about doubt. Doubt actually can lead to beauty because you start doubting your narrative, doubting the way things experience. And in that, you're then open to actually seeing the ocean in that way, right? You go through the anxiety. The doubt was the gift of the possibility of that experience of beauty. But that is let doubt, not poured doubt. Let doubt is the process of the breaking down to the place where you can have that experience of beauty. When you pour doubt, that's when you get self-effacement. This is the trick. Doubt is precisely the road to both beauty or self-effacement. The question is the holding of it. Are you letting the doubt work you to, wait a minute, are you sure that aesthetics and beauty are the same? Let's doubt that. No, the strike of beauty is different from what I thought it was, right? You need doubt to experience the strike of beauty if you're enclosed in something that keeps you from having that. Like you need to doubt you're a good person in order to actually realize virtues in the classical sense, right? Like doubts are precisely the road to those experience of beauties, but the trick is that there's a doubt that is a letting, and then there's a doubt that's a pouring. And the problem is there's increasingly an awareness of the necessity of doubt to break people out of their enclosures. So we're trying to accelerate it with pouring, and all that does is deconstruct because that's bad literature. That's a bad story. That's not how stories work. So you're basically setting people up for bad literature, and it's bad storytelling. So it doesn't, so then doubt does not become something that breaks you out of enclosures that are opening you up to beauty. And I think that, to me, that philosophy is about being, if we use the Julie Rest notion on the hospice, philosophy is about being able to be in a hospice, not to give people cancer to come to the hospice. That's the distinction. Like the world in this historic moment is an unfolding of doubt, is an unfolding of things breaking down. That's the spreading of philosophical melancholia that David Hume said defined basically the globalized world. Philosophical melancholia is spreading. It's occurring. And because you don't have people with the capacity to meet people as that occurs, then it's just turning into tribalism, turning into a loss of beauty and all of these different things, right? But then the philosopher says, man, we got to save people from their totalitarianism. Let's pour on the doubt. Let's pour on the deconstruction. That's bad literature. That doesn't work. It creates a melodrama. It doesn't work. What happens is people aren't ready for it, so they're not able to develop with it in a manner of like good literature, right? And the philosopher then has to be thinking about the letting of doubt, not the pouring of doubt, so that the doubt can actually have them work, to have them doubt the things that keep them from wonder or beauty, or actually being able to see the sea in that manner, and actually not actually being, say, susceptible to false hopes or manipulations or things like that. So I think there's a difference but I'll pause and give it to Mr. Luba. There's a difference between like this poured doubt or this letting doubt. And I would say the responsibility of the philosopher is about to work yourself to the place of being there to let doubt as opposed to pour doubt. And that's a fine distinction that I think requires a lot of work in the other. But let me give it to Mr. Luba. Mr. Luba.
This is fantastic. I mean, we've talked a lot privately, Daniel, about this, pouring from the top down notion, but using it in this context, I mean, it really like clarifies the landscape for sure, for me at least. So like what I'm thinking about is let's take like a religious position. So like Zizek's Christian atheism. I think this is a good example where you have, okay, you have Christian atheism, you have the story of atheism, you have the story of Christianity, you have, you know, what they appear to be opposites. They appear to have a tension. This tension brings out some type of theme in my mind, which allows an unfolding of a possible religious position known as Christian atheism. So I'm assuming, you know, with these Abrahamic religions, something like that also occurred where there was seemingly contradictions being put together in order to create some unfolding. I'm trying, because we're talking a lot about plot, narrative, story. I'm under the impression they're not the same thing. So like when Win is saying there could be a universal plot, and I like wrote in the group, I don't think there can be. I think maybe maybe I'm looking at plot differently than Win, and maybe that's why that's the case. I'm trying to understand the distinction between these three things, because as it relates to let's just say Christian atheism for a second. I think from an outsider, I'm looking at Christian atheism as I'm pinpointing specific things that Christian atheism's position takes. That to me would be a plot. Let's say it's like literally pointing. Plot, like it's like a point on a linear chart, so to speak, is how I see it. Where narrative is almost like the phenomenological unfolding of that linear plot. It's like, this is my narrative. This is my narrative on Christian atheism. So in that sense, it's gone a step further. It's like I've embodied this concept or this religious disposition, and now this is my beliefs and this is what I do. This is my actions that I take now that I have embodied it. So it seems like narration is almost like more plot equals maybe, yeah. That makes sense to me. Just knee-jerk historical expression of this principle. Yeah, I feel that. So story. So this is where I think story is interesting, because I think story isn't necessarily the phenomenological, you know, expression. It's not how I see the expression per se. It's more about possibility, because there is no definitive expression. The story requiring encounter of, definitely, because it is the encounter of otherness, and you can't really have a determination of otherness. It becomes a possibility. I can't boil, you know, Jockin, Daniel, whoever, down to a singular, you know, conception. That would be just a derivative of Daniel, Jockin, whoever. Yeah. Exactly. Where narratives encounter otherness, other narratives. Exactly. Yeah, this is great, Daniel. No, but I don't give a shit. Yeah, that's great. So what I'm thinking is we can have a shared plot. So I think Win is right. We can have a shared plot where everybody has the ability from their own narrative to kind of point to some plot in which the narrative is situated in. But a universal story can't be a case, because the story seems to be the tension in which narrations collide via belonging to a plot. So it seems like we're in deep shit in the sense that everyone has their personal narrations that don't belong to a plot. And the possibility of not even having a narration might even be currently existing, because you have to be aware of some plot in order to have some narration. You have to have the awareness, the ability to point to something in which you're situated in. Oh, sorry. And you can't choose otherness. Yeah, you can't choose. Exactly. So I think story, then it becomes almost impossible to really investigate what story is, because there's just like this lack of belonging that you talk about a lot. And so I think if you're able to get to the story dimension, you're able to play with how one's able to point to plot points and be able to play with their own narration. So narration, almost like that Layman Pascal Cadell interview when Cadell brought up Michelle's bird example, and Layman goes like, well, I would make an amendment to it where it's not just that, it's a ever changing of holding, letting the bird go free, and grabbing the bird. It's so having a narration as a storyteller means that it's an open narration. You grip it sometimes, you know when to let go of it sometimes. It's not fixed. Yeah, agreed. Yes, exactly. So this is why I think reading philosophy as a storyteller is great, because then you read philosophy, a story kind of chooses you, like a story jumps out to you when you're reading like particular concepts. So yeah, I agree with that. Sorry, but so I think the question is, like, how do we get to focusing on the story dimension? And once we do focus on the story dimension, how do we embody that? And how do we embody that in a pluralistic society? How do we embody that globally? Because I don't think there could be a global story. I do think there could be a global plot. And I do think, cultures need to have certain narrations that aren't fixed. They aren't static. So how do you have that? And then once you have those things, then you enter the story. But maybe it's ironic where you kind of have to maybe ignore those things and just focus on how to have a story, and then those other things kind of fall into place. I'm not really sure. I'm kind of just thinking out loud based off what everyone's saying. I'm just trying to. It's a lot's being said.
No, outstanding. I mean, there's a real sense in which if we get our Buba quota in honor of Mr. Rivera, you can't choose the thou. Story is the thou. Like a story doesn't begin without a thou, and you can't choose it. All you can do is prepare for a thou that may never come. So there's a real risk there. It's an absolute choice. And I think also you can't have a global story in the sense of all you could do is have a global preparation for the possibility of story. And that's creating liminal web networks that deal with introduction problems, increasing the probability of encounterology, and people also seeing examples, models of people who dwell and wait and do philosophy and gain capacities, knowing darn well they may never use them, and yet they do it nevertheless, which then makes it intelligible to do that. It's easier to follow that example, and then more and more people can do that. And then that's also increasing the probability that people will be available in the hospice per se when people are there, right? Because if the greater number of people of whom meet who are indeed using philosophy to get to the point of narration and plot in the way we are describing, to gain capacities, but then not overfitting to have philosophy be story, thus replace otherness or do step in for otherness. This would speak where philosophy overreaches and replaces beauty, thus collapses the good and the beautiful, and you get all the pathologies in allusion to Mr. Jockin's work. So philosophy, like Hume would always say, philosophy has to honor something non-rational, something outside of it, right? Pre-rational. Well, basically the thou, the story, is the non-rational. It is always the thing outside of which the beauty, the thing all philosophy can do, is create the clearing, to use Heideggerian language, for its possibility, but not stepping into the clearing. So there's something remarkably, humble, or there's something about philosophy that it's just so hard to not step in to try to be the story. But if it does that, then it eats itself, and nobody then ironically you move from being someone in the hospice to treat people with cancer to giving people cancer so that they come to the hospice and you can treat them. That's what keeps happening, is philosophy goes from being the guy, you're sitting in the hospice, to use this example because I think it really speaks to it. You're in the hospice and you're like, no one's coming. I've spent all this time learning how to treat people in the hospice. I've read all these books and nobody's here. Well, I'm going to give people cancer then. And that sounds terrible, but that's basically what's going on with philosophy. I'm going to infect people with philosophical melancholia deconstruction, and doubt so that I have a role. And that's what's happening. It's like a hospital, like philosophy when it steps into the realm of trying to be the story or trying to be the beautiful. Now that's a movie, right? Like to be the beautiful, it then has to give people the melancholia so they come to the hospice. And then they come to the hospice and you're like not even good at treating them because you poured all your resources into giving people cancer. So you're not any good at actually being with them now. And actually the whole time you did this to them, so you're not actually able to dwell with them because you did this to them. So it's all like it's disingenuous in that way. But let me pause and give it to Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Nietzsche would call like the will to power, right? Like this sort of yearning to dominate somehow. I've been working on a novel recently and I haven't been planning it at all. Like I just been sitting down every day, 30 minutes, writing it, and it's turning out insane. Why? Because somehow this main character is fluctuating between hallucinations, memories, and dreams. And yet I always write the character as if he restrains from entertaining any mystery at all. He sort of lets like the mystery be. He never decides to like prod further. But I guess this made me think about that we don't always have the energy. And I've been always thinking about Nietzsche's idea of self-preservation. Because as much as I know, right? Like I know that we shouldn't do things top down, right? There are moments when we get captured by our own narratives. And you could call those insecurities. Like I would say, like in the context of partnership between your friends or your lover, whatever it may be, there's moments where you know that this is simply an insecurity and so on. But then there's the moments where that's when you are aware of it. It shows that you have enough energy to not succumb to it. But then there's moments when you are helpless against it. And this is the part that I find really interesting because it really shows the in-betweenness of care between two people. Where if you know your partner well enough, you can see them succumb to insecurities and you can understand like, they're playing out a narrative right now in front of me and they're helpless against it because they cannot help against this insecurity right now because they don't have enough energy to soothe themselves away from it. And this happens between partners all the time sometimes. It happens to me. But when it happens to me, right, my partner is able to sort of like almost attend, right, cultivate, be there in a sort of like hospice type of care. Because in some ways we realize that we cannot immediately strip away the insecurity as much as we want to strip away the insecurity because that insecurity is so almost non-rational that it cannot be dealt with at that moment of immediacy. It would have to be dealt with afterwards, after when the other person has more energy to talk about it, to discern it. And there's multiple conversations where I've had with my partner where we both admit to each other, like, if we had just talked about it the next day, we would have had a much better conversation, right? And it's because the insecurity almost captures us momentarily in such a deep narrative that, and you might even see yourself being captured by it and helpless, completely helpless against it, because this is what we would call like emotions. Like that this is not true. But emotionally, you're playing out a very angry or sad person inside. And so that right there shows that you're already captured by the narrative. And I guess like when I talk about elements of self-preservation, I guess that's elements of self-preservation for me is more like allowing knowing that the energy is not enough to overcome it. That it's okay to shrink down and let let yourself be cared for, or care for yourself for a little while, mend your wounds, to come back out and be able to, I mean, this is very similar to Thomas Wynn's story of having the panic attack. Like he is intelligent enough to know that this is not the thing. But the thing is, when you're so captured by the thing, you're tempted to completely, you're helpless against it in some ways. So I was thinking about the in-between care of other beings that is sort of necessary. Because I guess when we talk about the responsibility of being able to not pour down from the top, we also are vulnerable ourselves to either sometimes being tempted to pour down from the top, or to, because like being tempted to pour down from the top can also be seen as a sign of insecurity, right? Like you can't allow others to be as they are because it's more frightening, it's unbearable, it's upsetting, it's so on. So I mean, this temptation is very like strong, which, you know, which for me, like it's sometimes it's good to just take a break from philosophy and just breathe a little, because I've noticed that with myself. It's just it's a temptation, the temptation at the door. Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that I'll finish this up with Buber. The one thing that I always liked with his interview with Carl Rogers, and this is important, and this is why I think universality cannot be as universal as we think it should be, is precisely because the patient has to be seen as capable as helping the therapist. And this is something that he told Carl Rogers. So that means even the person that we see enamored, trapped in the narrative, we have to be willing to be open to let the showing show us that there is something in there. There is something that is bestowing to us that can also help us in turn. And that's something I think about all the time. And this is why the temptation to pour from the top is always so tempting, because you don't want to believe. I don't know if you guys read The Kite Runner at all, where Amir is talking to Hassan and he's telling him his story that he made up, right? And Hassan finds the plot hole in his story. And he says, wait a second, why did he have to kill his wife to cry when he could have just had onions in his face? And Amir was so distraught by that plot hole that for a moment he said, how could this illiterate kid, completely illiterate, see that instead of me? And to me, that's a perfect example of the fact that he wasn't anticipating that someone like Hassan could help him.
No, magnificent. You know what I would say. So to that point, then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, and if anyone has final things to say, please. We'll have Michelle is making a tremendous meal, and Maria and Jurij and different things will be fun. But we've really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed this. One of the mistakes that I think people make in storytelling is they think that you move the story along by adding inciting incidents or adding problems and different things. Really, good stories move along. And I say story here versus narration plot. A story is a matter of increasing seeing. Like when we talk about an address, like to addressing belonging is going to primarily be a matter of increasing seeing, like the ability of people to see things, more so than like how do you solve the problem of belonging, or what's got, like Mr. Wynn, good to see you, sir, right? Because the issue is, if you're not careful, then you're just in the energy, right? Like more energy does not necessarily more seeing. And often a lot of disputes between people, if you can just have, well, hold on, let's just try to see more of what's going on. It almost takes care of itself, or at least gives you more directions, right? So what's interesting is often an address is more a matter of seeing than solution versus solution than seeing, right? It's all about order. It's so often order, right? Like if you have a, because I know there's always that tension of, well, you don't want to, like in relationships, well, I don't want you to solve the problem. I just want you to be here, right? And that seems true. But then the dwelling is about, I want to be here for the unfolding until more sight occurs. That's the issue. Like there's this weird way in which the philosopher is training in how to be there in a manner, speaking in a manner that opens sight. So then the story unfolds as opposed to, and that's how good stories work. Like good stories are not just inciting incident, random villain, like all of that is in service of increasing the ability of the protagonist to see what was always already in operation that they had to go on this journey to see. Frodo had to go on this journey to see the Shire, dang it. Like Homer, everyone has to go on these journeys to see the beauty that was always already there that you could not see. And the inciting incidences are in service of that ability to see. And so that's the issue though, is that if you're an overly pragmatic, overly utilitarian, or overly trying to fix things, then you lose sight of fixing is in service of seeing, not the end of things, right? It's all about that frickin' order thing. If you put first things first, you get second things also. You put second things first, you lose both. So the problem is a good story writer starts the work to where there's something in there that can be seen more of through the inciting incidences, not just the inciting it. And that's how you turn a plot narrative into a story. The story is the same. So basically, on this question of, okay, how do we deal with belonging again, geopolitics and different things, we've talked about in different ways. It has to be a matter of increasing the probability of increased seeing, per se, for the average person on planet Earth, or have the capacity to see things at higher iterations, which then is climbing the ladder ultimately toward beauty, right? As we've talked about, like ultimately, beauty is a matter of seeing. Beauty is not a solution, right? It's a matter of seeing, and yet weirdly, in gaining a range of sight or greater seeing or seeing things, it's almost like it's a kind of solution, but it's different from hammering a nail. It's almost like a melting. It's like it moves away because you go to a higher iteration and it transforms in its character, right? That flip moment, that transformation of what moving to greater sight does to a problem is fascinating because it's different in experience than kind of solving. It's almost like, oh yeah, I misunderstood you. So there's actually no problem. It's like it clears away actually, or actually this energy that I can't deal with. My problem was I had this energy I couldn't deal with. You came and helped like bring it to the place where I could do something with it. And yet it's almost like I didn't even realize that was in operation as you were here. It kind of melts away in a way. And that's the weird move that occurs that the thou makes possible. But also that critical point you just said, you have to believe there's something in the other for you, that it's not a hierarchical relationship. Like if you're the therapist, a good therapist believes that the patient can teach them something. A good teacher believes you can learn from something from the student, not just saying that because you're supposed to say that, but genuinely believe it, right? But that's the possibility of a strike of beauty. Like you believe there's something there that can strike you. You believe there's something there that like in the other, you've trained yourself to the place that in the encounter, you're able to actually hold the disposition of genuinely believing there's something there that can strike you. And that's a seeing thing. You're positioning yourself to see that. So you're not like it's all about moving into a position for the possibility of seeing that thing. And that greater seeing is an address versus solving the problem. You're addressing like it by increasing the seeing. And moving to that iteration, which then we associate with climbing to a view. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, and then if any other thoughts. Mr. Jockin.
We got to close out. I mean, well, this conversation, 2 notes. I wish Wyndham was still in the group because I wanted to talk about his anxiety attack symptom, what was going on there. I'm reminded in Phaedrus in my dialogue series on Plato, on the Doctor of the Soul as the dialectic rhetorician, as an example here. So the idea of, and I think of this with Javier's question of aftercare. What happens if the narratives and figures we operate on are shattered? I bring this up because generally what's happened is if you look at the principle of explosion, basically if you find out there's a contradiction in your logic in something that you're working with, basically means everything's possible. It's kind of using an analogy idea. When you divide by 0, now every number equals every number, right? We've now justified every single possibility. So, and that degree, that is absolutely abyss of freedom. Like that's in terms of the symptomology of a complete like anxiety attacks and anomie, like the shattering of narrative can basically destroy us. Absolutely. Because we're not prepared. Like we're not prepared for the freedom that God gives us, that God has. remember, we're the animal that possesses logos. We are not logos. There is a difference. The possession of a thing does not mean you actually are the thing, meaning possession, just because a proposition has truth does not mean it is truth, for example. That's kind of using an analogy to draw out that point. I'm just saying this because, so part of this kind of part of the issue is when we talk about, like, remember, this is the whole issue of Socrates coming to people in dialogue and working with them as a dialectic rhetorician, is operate in that way he presents in Phaedrus. He's very attuned to the decision of what do they respond with and what level of initiation he's going to present to someone. He's very sensitive about that because he knows that if a presentation happens too much and they're not prepared for it, it will destroy them. It will shatter them. The only one that people can be prepared for and handle at any time is the beautiful. I mean, it's basically that point. It is the beautiful that is the only one everyone is prepared to handle at any time. It's not destroy us versus justice or wisdom and the other forms, as an example. Because this idea of, I just bring this up because the idea of treatment, like that's our modern condition. The modern condition is the nature of anxiety. We've been put into this state of absolute, basically of given freedom or demonstrated it. And we're not equipped. The presentation of anxiety, usually the people who experience that is because they're getting blasted with this recursive loop of their operational intellect operating on noticing errors and then freaking out because they're realizing from the recursive loop, this is nothing. Thus, and that causes like equals death. We're going to get destroyed by it. So that's what's happening there. As I'm chewing on that. So a good philosopher, ideally, is to be a doctor of the soul. Is to actually, I talked to one of my people this morning about it. Instead of basically entering into a state of basically privational negation, just running them through that recursive loop, it needs to be a vivification. Basically, the soul needs to be vivified to show basically that it's what we talk about lack as a creative possibility. Right? Not the lack of privational destruction and death and pain, but instead the kind of movement of creative possibility. That takes incredible cultivation to do that. Most people, that's when we talk about heroic virtue, that's what we're talking about. That is a great overcoming, that to get into the abyss and to kind of look on the other side and see that as possibility of generation, not just of absolute destruction. Trust me, I've encountered, I was going to say to win, I've experienced that too. And actually, I've gotten older as I've actually gotten pangs of that even worse, quite frankly. It's a nice thing when that's the point. When you're ignorant and you get to operate under some narrative, you don't get those pains now, do you? You get other problems, but you don't get that problem. You get other issues. It takes a real cultivation of the soul to overcome that, to kind of work through with that kind of horrendous pang of anxiety, of the recursive loop of error, and misunderstanding what's going on there. But I like these notes of like the waiting, the preparation. I think the idea of what can we do, what would X do, these kind of states of preparation, of cultivation of the soul to be ready to act. I think about these things in terms of this kind of what education is supposed to do, right? Stripping away to open up those possibilities. I say that because what you're saying is there's a very big difference where education is supposed to be exposition, just to dump shit on people, pouring in just to dump content into people, versus setting up context for people to respond. And then working with the material given to you to kind of put the fires of resonance, of insight. And I say on the last note, this idea of like you're talking about this idea of seeing more, Daniel. I had in my note recognize, to see, and I specifically this language of, isn't it interesting? A lot of times we're absolute desires to be understood. Like most of our pain is that sense of alienation of not being understood. So that maxim, seek first to understand, then to be understood, and it's incredibly powerful because what it does is it gives emotional oxygen to the other party, that you are seeing, you're recognizing the other through their circumstance, through the situation, the figures and arrangement at hand. And then you can present something with that, usually in recognition, et cetera, building off on that. So I'm chewing on this point because I think it's a very, in terms of what is the cultivation of beauty, is part of it is this basically that there's a kind of redounding possibility. I think it's kind of like the biggest note is this kind of idea that the biggest problem when people capture narratives is that they think there's nothing else there. They think that everything outside it is nothing, versus because the idea of kind of contrary is that there's always two. It's not one. right? There's an idea of there's the excess and the deficient, not just the mean of the middle intermediary. Yeah, I just chew on that because that's kind of like what tends to be the push, is that what moves us and cultivates us towards acting through possibility. Like that's basically what virtue allows you to do. Virtue, one way to articulate it, is the capacity to respond in challenge, basically in moments of lack or challenge, to overcome it and actualize. Like that's kind of, I think, of a chewing part of this.
What do you want?
Yeah, so I think I'm kind of chewing on this. Is kind of like, and Dan, I think your note about what you said about like a good teacher should be always surprised. I think that's absolutely true, because I think that's totally the case. Like if you're not in a kind of vivified love of the topic, that in every engagement of the topic, there's always a potential, a potency, a potential of surprise, that a pupil might reveal something in some mode, in some way you didn't anticipate or didn't expect, and you're vivified and drawn by it. I resonate a lot with that. I think that's very important. I think it's a very important sign when you're bored of a topic and you no longer have no interest to be moved by it, to be surprised by it, and then you're dead. You shouldn't be teaching it at that point. I think these are really good points. But I think I just want to kind of chew on this point. It's like, it is true. Like, how do we treat in the aftercare, the hospice of when people's narratives are destroyed, when they're shattered, and in confrontation of error and failure, etc.? What is the doctor of the soul's treatment of this? We generally kind of have an attitude of indifference. We just kind of let people go, you'll figure it out. I find that really cruel. I mean, I feel like the fact that we have no positive answer, we just kind of collectively shrug in a kind of indifference. I think I'm chewing on that. I think that's a very, I think it's a missed opportunity there. I do think it is. And I think just to simply say that's an issue of psychology alone, I don't know about that. I think there's something more to that, and I'll yield there.
Delightful. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hate to run. A few things come to mind. What is it? Wittgenstein said that often we give people a definition when we need to give them like an experience. We need to give them something like that. I think that's part of the problem, is people in aftercare need an example. They need an experience. They need a relationship. They need to see a model, an exemplar. Mr. Luber, good to see you. And instead, there's just solutions. Because there's this interesting tension. We've talked before about the problem of solutions, right? People give solutions, but then there's another sense in which it's like, well, if the tire of the car is broke, then you put on a new tire, right? Perhaps we can think of this also too with the difference between pouring on solutions and letting solutions arise from the dwelling, right? Like there seems to be a difference between the letting and the pouring, right? And also it should be noting that surprise cannot occur from pouring. Pouring from the top, there's no surprise from that. Letting is required for surprise, right? Letting is required for true encounter, right? So there has to be a certain letting, but letting is a posture of seeking to understand, not to solve. And this is what's funny. If you try to understand, like, if you're trying to solve somebody's problems all the time, they're like, screw you, I want to be understood. And then we let the solution come after that. That seems to be, you're pouring in the solution from the top. You're pouring it in. That's not what you're supposed to do. We're supposed to understand. And in creating the understand, now there's the possibility of story, because what are you doing when you're understanding? You're coming to share their narrative. I'm coming to understand your principles. I'm coming to share your narrative. Now let's see if the story happens. That's always outside of you, right? The solution has to come to you outside of you with no guarantee of it happening, or else the solution is poured in from the top. And then it feels alienating, and it's like meaning poured in from the top, right? So it's interesting where understanding to solution is letting solution, whereas basically 99.9% of the time what we end up doing is pouring in the solution, and therefore it actually alienates us and causes new pathologies, right? So it goes with philosophy. Like a lot of times philosophers pour in philosophy that may be true. Maybe the philosophy is 100% correct. Maybe the solution actually is correct. Like the solution you tell the person is in fact what they need to do. But just like a good event in a story, if it's poured in from the top, is then bad. Like you could have an awesome action sequence in a story, but because you pour it in from the top, it's contrived and it doesn't work, right? Just because it is a solution that would work, it cannot violate the logic of a good story, or else it's contrived and you lose it. You lose the unfolding of the story, right? So that's the rub. A lot of people, you see it in storytelling all the time. People go, wow, this is a really good twist. This is a really good action sequence. It's amazing. But then they pour it in from the top. Likewise, this solution actually would make their situation better, but you pour it in from the top, so it's contrived and it doesn't work, right? Like just because it's an amazing action sequence doesn't mean you can skip the logic of storytelling, right? Just by, it breaks it, right? So there's something similar here. I think that's an operation. I think, and then therefore belonging again, and the address of the belonging again has to follow the logic of an unfolding story. So it creates a space for that unfolding, but ultimately the story is the thou that has to come to you, right? And then you see something in that because you're prepared for that possibility. A few more things. I think also a way, like love is always Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. Like love is always going to eventually have the experience of the fight, the misunderstanding that can reduce you to ass, right? So the subject of philosophy is almost the love craft of wisdom. It could be craft in parentheses with a hyphen, like the craft of loving wisdom, knowing how to do it, or it could be the Lovecraft of wisdom because you're not ready for it, so it reduces you to ass, right? Like one of the revelations of, I think, philosophy is precisely that good things in the wrong way are destructive. So if you pour in a solution, it's destructive as opposed to let a solution. If you pour in hope versus let hope, it's destructive, right? Like, so it goes likewise with love. Like there's a certain awareness of letting, and basically love that operates by a logic of pouring in from the top turns into a Lovecraft, and then there's all sorts of problems, right? And it would seem as if without Lovecraft, though, like learning that art form, which is philosophy, you cannot meet the precondition necessary for the strike of beauty. Like love as risk, love as Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses is the necessary field of working and cultivation so that you're in the space for the possibility of the beauty, which is the strike of the thou, the story that can hit you, right? But like the Lovecraft is the operation, if you will, of learning to work with plot narrative. You work with those things. Okay, now we've created the possibility of the strike of beauty. But the trick is that the philosopher is always dealing with very dangerous things. Love is actually very dangerous. If you do it wrong, it can destroy you. Well, so we were saying with doubt. Doubt could free you to experience beauty, but it could also lead to self-effacement. Like you're always training with things that are actually quite dangerous. You're always working with things that's dangerous. But if you don't deal with dangerous things, there's no possibility of the strike of beauty, right? But then the problem is precisely the danger of those things is why you wouldn't let them be. Of course they're dangerous. You're not going to let them be. We need to pour the water on the fire. We need to put it out. We need to solve this. We need to get rid of it, right? And then it turns out it's one of those fires that if you put water on it, it gets worse, actually. You know, it doesn't actually go out. And you're like, oh, crap, it's too late. The oven just exploded now. So, like, this is the issue, is that, like, you're dealing with something that you have to, it's almost like how firefighters, I guess if I'm thinking metaphorically on that fire thing, like good firefighters, like with forest fighters, they actually like direct the fire. There's a lot more making the fire go to a place where it's going to burn out, you know, and only pouring water in the areas that's going to direct the fire. So it's more of a process of letting than it is pouring water on the fire and letting it go, right? Now, I don't know how far to push that metaphor, but I think that's a lot of how philosophy actually, you know, is. And it's like, how do you let? How do you work this letting? Because if you pour, it can just make things worse. But that then means that philosophy and narratology, as Bard says, or storytelling, are structurally very, very similar. And I think owning that is how one is ready to receive people in hospice, which runs the risk of having skills that you never ever use. But that's precisely the risk you're willing to take because you've accepted that's needed to be done. But I appreciate this. It's been wonderful. It's good to see you, Javier Rivera. It's good to see you, Thomas, Jockin, Michelle. Always a treat. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed it a lot. All the best to you, gentlemen. All the best. Thank you.